Welcome to the second session of the Seeds of Wisdom Symposium at the intersection of wisdom and action. This is a 2-hour session taking place at the Sweet Springs Resort Park here in Sweet Springs, West Virginia. And it will include a question and answer segment after the speakers have given their presentations. Bienvenue à la deuxième session des Assises de la Sagesse, à l'intersection de la sagesse et de l'action. C'est une session de 2 heures qui a lieu ici au Sweet Springs Resort Park, sur la côte est des États-Unis. Et à la fin des présentations par des intervenants, il y aura une session questions et réponses. Et on parlera au moment venu. Our first speaker is L. David Roper, addressing entropy, complexity, and sustainability. Dave is a PhD physicist and professor emeritus at the University of Virginia Polytechnic Institute. He's also the co-founder of Sustainable Blacksburg. He will demonstrate how the fundamental laws of physics provide a basis for the wise use of resources and establish a correlation between physics and biology. He also embraces the widespread use of solar energy as a means of reducing entropy. Entropy is the measure of disorder in a system which, if left unchecked, will eventually lead to chaos. He's with us today in person. Alors, notre premier intervenant d'aujourd'hui, c'est David Roper, qui parlera de l'entropie, la complexité et la durabilité. Dave est titulaire d'un doctorat en physique et il est professeur émérite à l'Institut Polytechnique de l'Université de la Virginie. Il démontre comment les lois fondamentales de la physique peuvent servir de base pour l'utilisation sage de l'énergie et d'autres ressources terrestres. Il établit la corrélation entre la physique et la biologie et encourage l'utilisation généralisée de l'énergie solaire comme moyen de réduire l'entropie. L'entropie est la mesure du désordre dans un système qui, sans être atténué, finit par conduire au chaos. Et je voulais aussi dire que Dave Roper est un des cofondateurs de Blacksburg Durable. Blacksburg est une ville universitaire dans le sud dans la Virginie. Et il a établi un truc foisonnant de gens qui produisent leur propre nourriture, qui ont des serres à la fois géothermales et solaires passives, etc. Donc voilà, je passe le siège à David Roper. Okay. You.
Hello. Pleasure to be here. Okay, I'm going to share a PowerPoint. And there it is right there. The title of this talk is Entropy, Complexity, and Sustainable Development and Sustainable Agriculture. It has my URL at the bottom that contains all the slides that you can look anytime you want later. And it has my email if anybody wants to contact me. Okay, so we'll go to the next slide. Press enter isn't doing it, so we got to figure out how to get the next one. I thought I just pressed enter.
Yeah, enter, what did you do? No, okay, maybe what we have to do is go up and down, so down.
Okay.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay. Sustainability definition that I'm using is meeting the needs of present humans, excuse me, without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. This is not possible in an isolated or closed system because decay will always occur. For sustainable Earth, energy materials from outside the Earth have to be used. Getting energy from the sun is much easier than getting material from the moon or asteroids. That is why solar and wind energy is necessary to have sustainable development and sustainable agriculture. So what is entropy? It's another word for it is disorder of the universe. The ultimate closed system always increases. The universe is the ultimate closed system. Okay, the entropy of an open system is a system that exchanges matter energy with its environment, can increase or decrease, but if it decreases, the entropy of its total environment must increase, such that the entropy of this universe always increases. To decrease the entropy of the system, it must be open. This is how biological systems decrease their entropy, that is, increase their order. They do so by increasing the entropy of the sun and their environment. They're open to external systems. They're not closed. To keep the increase of entropy of the system on Earth to a low value, make the system as open as possible, ultimately including the sun. You must include the sun if you want to have it totally open. So how humans increase Earth's entropy? Materials taken from the Earth to make inanimate items and eventually scattered all over the Earth. That increases entropy. Materials taken from the Earth and used to produce energy that turns into heat. For example, coal, oil, natural gas. It increases entropy. And converting one form of energy to another. For example, converting mechanical energy of steam created by burning coal into electrical energy always increases entropy. So to minimize Earth's surface entropy increase, increase energy efficiency of all processes, reduce consumption of Earth resources, reuse and recycle materials, use geothermal energy, increasing entropy inside instead of on the Earth's surface. You can take heat from inside the Earth, but you can decrease entropy on the surface by increasing entropy inside the Earth. Best of all, use solar energy instead of energy from burning fossil fuels or other organic material. Wind energy is a special case of solar energy. I'll mention more about that later. So components of solar decreasing entropy on Earth. Electromagnetic radiation from the sun and all the different regions of the spectrum, optical, infrared, ultraviolet, radio, etc. Winds due to temperature differences on the Earth caused by the sun and to rotation of the Earth, the direction of the winds. Water movement due to evaporation into the atmosphere and condensation from clouds. Plants and trees due to photosynthesis, but also increases entropy of the Earth by taking nutrients from the soil and air. So plants and trees are quite complicated in this way. Okay, entropy and complexity and diversity. For sustainable development or agriculture, what is needed is low entropy or high order and high complexity. Highly complex systems can partially manage themselves. When one system fails, other systems take up the slack. For example, human body or an organized neighborhood. Sometimes this involves redundant subsystems such as 2 kidneys in humans and 2 computers in self-driving cars, a car like I drive. Sometimes there is a sweet point at which complexity or order has a phase change such that it has some self-management. We call that an emergent phenomenon for some finite time. Beyond the sweet point features, high complexity, high order or low entropy, reproducing system like the humans, self-healing, and rationality. This is just a curve I've thought from my own thoughts about things that I have experience with. You could plot your own. Basically, order is to the right, which means disorder is to the left, and complexity is up. And if you look through there, for example, my electric car is over, it's highly ordered, and it's pretty complex. Even more complex, of course, is the Earth way up at the top, and then the solar system, and then ultimately the universe. You can make these own graphs of your own experience. For example, I have my shed. It's got a little order, but not as much as it should, and it's not very complex. So given all this that we've talked about, what is sustainable development? It's a system involving humans is never closed. It is always connected to the environment. If a human-created subsystem has decreasing entropy, for example, development, the environment to which it's connected will have increasing entropy. If humans are to reduce harm to the Earth's environment and thus have a resilient society, they must design a society to largely use the entropy increase of the sun to keep the entropy increasing from our development, or hopefully decrease it, and minimize the entropy increase of the Earth, local and Earth environments. So more of what is sustainable development and sustainable agriculture must have a high degree of complexity, designed using rational principles, requires much research and design effort and initially more administration. Design with sufficient complexity and diversity to move toward a sweet point for some self-management automatically adjust to a changing environment. Design for long-range local and Earth environments benefit, not just current human benefit. And that's hard to get humans to do. Legacy development, the development that is had done in the past without much consideration for sustainable development, uses low entropy, high complexity Earth materials to produce low entropy, high complexity products, with total local and Earth entropy and complexity increasing. Available low energy, high complexity Earth minerals are small compared to projected future needs. Entropy of available Earth materials increases with time. The good stuff is extracted first. Then after that, the materials are in higher entropy. Eventually, all minerals extracted from the Earth will be more uniformly scattered around the Earth. That is, they'll be at high entropy. So we want to make sure that doesn't happen any faster than it has to. It's all involved, of course, in reducing waste. The goal, of course, is to waste nothing, but that's unachievable because of the second law of thermodynamics. You're always going to waste something. The realistic goal is to minimize waste. One way to do that is to establish cluster industries, where some of the waste from an industry is used as input in another local industry. This minimized transportation entropy increase and waste disposal. Require use of hardy products such as bottles, lumber, and bricks. Quit manufacturing single-use items such as plastic bags and non-recyclable products. Institute local or curbside composting of food and yard waste. I just wanted to show you a neighborhood sharing composting that I have. I share it with a neighbor. We have 3 composting barrels. You can see one in the distance and 2 in the foreground. And there's also a green, you sort of see the green food digester for extremely cold weather. It's hard to turn a barrel when it's frozen and during the wintertime. So then you use the food digester, which is not as good as composting, because it will emit some carbon dioxide or methane. You see the covered ground with a sled on top of it, holding the cover in place. is a pit for drying out the compost. So, because when the compost comes out of one of these barrels, it's usually pretty wet, although it's fairly well composted. It just needs to dry out. And so I put it in the pit and cover it. And then when I empty the next barrel, and the next barrel gets full, before I empty it, I take a shovel and I shovel out the dry compost and just put it on the ground for people, the neighbor or my wife in her garden to use. So the dry compost from the pit on the ground. 2 barrels are composting while 1 barrel is being fed material to compost. And whenever you put composting material in 1 barrel, you turn it 3 times and you turn up the other 2 barrels 3 times also to mix it good. This works really well. It's really great for a neighborhood composting. So we need everywhere, either this kind of composting where neighbors are working together or curbside composting. And there are some cities that are doing that, not nearly enough. This is a curve of the United States oil extraction. I guess maybe we should skip that since most of you are not in the United States, but the idea is that at some point it peaks. And this curve is a fit to the data. It may not be accurate as to when it peaks, but I suspect that it probably is. There's a finite amount of oil in the earth of the United States, and at some point it's going to peak. And this curve shows it peaking at about 2035. It may be 2045 or 2050, but no matter, it peaks at some point. And so even if you don't want to have sustainability, you want to use just oil, you can't forever. You've got to quit at some point because it's going to peak. Similarly, world crude oil extraction, this involves us all. Right now it's way low. It may pick up next year, but it's going to peak too. And it looks like to me that it is on its way to peaking. So right now this curve shows it peaking about 2030. So if you just depend on oil for energy, you're going to be disappointed in the next 50 or 100 years. And then there's natural gas, of course. Natural gas is the big thing now in the United States and around the world for reducing electricity. But it's going to peak also, of course. And this peaking may be wrong because more data in the future may show that, but right now it's showing about 2035, 2040. It might be 2050, 2070, we don't know, but it's going to peak. No question about it. And then here's the world natural gas extraction, and it too will peak. And this one shows it about 2040. If you look at other materials that we use in our society, like iron and copper, bismuth and cobalt, et cetera, they all have similar curves. Although those we can recycle. You can't recycle oil if you use it to burn. You can only recycle if you use it to produce plastics, then you recycle the plastics. But the other materials will last longer than the curve would show because they will be recycled. In fact, here's one. I'll just show one. This is a fit to the iron ore of the world. And assuming certain fractions of recycling, you see your different recycling cycles as you move on, all those smaller and smaller curves. You can't recycle it all, of course. You only recycle a certain fraction. So each curve is smaller than the last one. If you add all those curves up, you get the red curve is the fit to the data, and the blue curve would be actual amount you would have to use at any given time if these assumptions I made here and these calculations are correct. Probably not correct, but they give you the idea of what happens. So anyway, you peak. Every material is going to peak. So at some point, I mean, you need to, of course, recycle all you can, but you're never going to be able to recycle all. So the amount of material we have to make things will decrease with time at a certain point. And we have to sort of long-term plan for that. Okay, so because of what I just told you, looking at all those curves, you can see they peak and then that goes down. So this means that if you depend on a society like we have now, where we depend on population growing, which is the problem really, and being able to use materials to do whatever we want is not going to be available in the long term. So we want to prevent this so-called civilization collapse. In other words, civilization as we know it has to be a new kind of civilization. And I'm not smart enough to tell you what that's going to be like. But I do know these things. We need to quit burning fossil fuels to keep global warming under control. We need to replace fossil fuels with solar and wind energy and energy storage so that you can use the solar and wind energy at night or when the wind is not blowing and when the sun's not shining. Wind energy actually sometimes is larger at night than it is in the daytime. So they sort of work together very well. Also, if you have a large continent like the United States and Europe, the wind energy is different in different parts of the continent as you move east or west. And solar energy is different in different parts of the continent, as you know. In the United States, in the west, energy is greater than it is in the east. So if you have new networks that are connected across the continent, then you can spread out the availability of these renewable energy. So use most of the remaining crude oil and natural gas to create the infrastructure for distributed renewable energy and energy storage to replace fossil fuels for energy. This is what we must do. And we're making progress. Things are, but not fast enough. So one of the things we need to worry about, though, is reliability or resiliency. We need to create community electrical microgrids. Microgrids, say, the size of a county or several counties or a province or several provinces, so that they're independent of the national grid when necessary for resilience. So if you have a power outlet in some part of the nation, it doesn't cause that outlet to spread to large portions of the nation. And we haven't done that yet. People realize it needs to be done. It's being done in certain places. I think they're working hard to do that in Puerto Rico right now, for example. So you need microgrids and have them all connected so that they can send their power to other microgrids. And we need to greatly increase product reuse and recycling. As I said, you can't do it totally, but we need to do what we can. And then the whole thing really hinges on reducing population growth by a huge worldwide birth control program. Because the more people you have, the more materials you need, and the faster the materials are going to run out. So their lifespans, for example, the average mammal species is about 1 million years. Species disappear. Homo sapiens evolved from early species 300 to 200,000 years ago. The average intelligent civilization, many people feel, is about 300,000 years. Oldest existing nation is Greece. I've read this, I hope it's true. If it's not, let me know. 5,200 years. So you can see there are these lifespans that we have to worry about. So our Homo sapiens evolved enough to survive weapons of mass destruction and global warming. That's a question that we don't know the answer to yet. However, there's a reason for optimism. reasons for optimism. Renewable power is growing exponentially around the world. Set in 2017, and this, I haven't updated this graph, but in 2017, it was 70% of net additions of energy around the world was renewable. I suspect it's more near 75% now. Crude oil extraction and natural gas extraction will peak by around 2030, maybe 2050. Organic farming is growing in this country, at least. I assume that's true around the world. Knowledge of global warming is increasing. I can see that in the last several years in this country, at least. Electric cars on roads are growing exponentially, and much hybrids and gasoline cars did when hybrids were introduced. They were much slower being accepted than electric cars are. So that's a plus. Some communities are requiring new homes to have solar panels on roofs and to be wired for electric car charging. And then 91% of millennials would consider purchasing an electric car in the United States. So the young people are our hope, of course, they always are for the future. This is just for the United States, but maybe it's true in other places too. This shows the change in the amount of fuel that's used for electrical energy. Coal is the blue curve. You see it's been dropping rapidly. And by 2030, it'll be mostly gone. It looks like we won't be burning coal anymore. The black line is nuclear energy. Nuclear energy is okay. It has its problems, but I don't think it's going to grow much. I mean, contrary to a lot of people feel, I don't feel that. And then you see the red curve is natural gas. It's been climbing, but as you saw in the previous curve, it's going to peak. It's going to peak at some point. And so I just sort of guessed how much that peaking will be with the dotted red curve. So it won't go straight on up like the straight line shows. It will turn over and go down. And renewable energy is exponentially increasing. That's the green curve. You see the data points in the green is the United States. So if these curves are correct, renewable energy by 2030 will be the dominant energy. So there's some hope, good news. We need to rapidly change to electrical cars and trains from gasoline and diesel. Okay, I believe that's the end of my talk.
Oh, okay. So I'm going to go back there.
Okay.
Talk about the question Merci beaucoup, Dave. Thank you so much, Dave, for this.
My pleasure.
And we will most likely, I already have some questions, but we'll do that at the end of all the presentations. So, see if anyone has questions, they can put them aside because we will be holding a question and answer period after all the speakers have made their presentations. Donc, vous avez peut-être des questions comme moi à poser à David. On aura une session une fois que tous les intervenants auraient présenté leur thème. Nous allons avoir une question et réponse qui commencera par des intervenants qui posent des questions aux autres et ensuite des questions par le chat. Donc, si vous avez une question, vous pouvez l'inscrire dans le chat dès maintenant. Alors, notre prochain intervenant, c'est Diane Dubois. So the next speaker is Diane Dubois, speaking on diversity has intrinsic value and its loss impoverishes society. Diane is a staff scientist at the Center for Biological Diversity, which is an international organization founded in 1989, which works through science, law, and creative media to save life on Earth. Diane holds a bachelor's degree in biology from Westfield State University and a master's degree in environmental science studies with a focus on conservation biology from Antioch University in New England. In her capacity as a staff scientist in the international program, Diane works to protect wildlife around the globe from unsustainable trade, with a focus on marine aquarium fish and various reptile species. She's with us today, first via the video she pre-recorded, so there wouldn't be any internet problems. And then she will be with us live on Zoom to answer questions towards the end of this session. Diane Dubois est notre prochaine intervenante. Elle parle sur la diversité qui possède une valeur intrinsèque et sa perte appauvrit la société. Diane est scientifique au Centre pour la diversité biologique, une organisation internationale fondée en 1989 qui œuvre en tandem avec les disciplines de la science, le droit et les médias créatifs pour sauvegarder la vie sur Terre. Diane est titulaire d'un baccalauréat en biologie de la Westfield State University et d'une maîtrise en biologie de conservation de l'Université d'Antioch en Nouvelle-Angleterre. En sa qualité de scientifique au programme international, Diane travaille à partager la faune du monde entier contre le commerce non durable, en focalisant sur les poissons d'aquarium marins et diverses espèces de reptiles. Elle est là aujourd'hui via vidéo préenregistrée qu'elle a fait exprès pour pas qu'il y ait de problème de connexion Internet. Et elle sera en live pour les questions et les réponses après toutes les présentations. Voilà, un très grand bienvenue à Diane Dubois.
Hi, everyone, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to speak today at the Sustainable Future Forum. I'm so glad to be a part of such a great event. My name is Diane Dubois, and I'm a biologist at the Center for Biological Diversity. I'm based in Asheville, North Carolina, which is on Cherokee land. For those of you who are not familiar with us, the Center for Biological Diversity is a nonprofit conservation organization. And we really specialize in the protection of endangered species and wild places. I mentioned I'm in Asheville. We also have staff and offices throughout the U.S. and one in Mexico as well. And as you can see on the slide here, we believe that the well-being of humans is deeply linked to nature. And that's why we work to secure a future for all species, great and small, on the brink of extinction. So I'm here today to talk about three things. First, I'm going to talk about what biodiversity is and why it's so important for sustainability. Then I'll discuss the current state of our natural world and the extinction or biodiversity crisis. You'll hear me use those words interchangeably that we are in right now. And finally, we will end on a high note, I promise, with global, local, and personal solutions that can bring us to a sustainable system where we are living in sync with nature and allowing for a planet with high biodiversity. So a good place to start is, what is biodiversity? Biodiversity is the variety of all life on Earth and their relationships to one another. So all of these living things that support and sustain each other, including us, are included under this umbrella. And because all of these things support and sustain each other, we are all intricately connected to each other's well-being. Now, before I get to the current state of biodiversity on our planet, I'll just touch on why biodiversity matters. So I mentioned that we're all connected. Well, one of the biggest reasons we need to protect biodiversity is because it is critical for our own health as humans. We rely on the great biodiversity of species to pollinate the plants that we eat, to filter the water in our rivers and streams, to give us healthy air to breathe. And I'm sure you can come up with other examples as well. I also personally believe that species have an inherent value. So even if we may not know exactly how they fit into what we know about the world yet, they still matter. And, you know, saving biodiversity is also important because for every species that we know is declining, there are many more that we just don't have the information on. If we look at an ecosystem and see that the biggest charismatic species that we all love is declining, that's probably a good sign that the species underneath it in that food web aren't doing so well either. It's an indicator that something is off and that the system is no longer sustainable. And therefore, we may lose more than we bargained for if we don't minimize the impact that we are having on this system. Okay, so the current state of things. I'm sure it's no surprise to those of you attending today that the way humans are currently interacting with our planet is not sustainable. We are in a global extinction crisis, meaning that species are going extinct much faster than what we'd expect naturally. And therefore, we are rapidly losing biodiversity. There are a number of ways that we can look at and quantify the current crisis, and I'll share a few here. But it's important to note that there are many species on Earth that have not been discovered by science, and many species that have been described by science that are currently declining without us even knowing it. So when we estimate how many species are in trouble, it may be an underestimate if we consider these other factors. So one of the tools that we have for knowing the state of our natural world is this red list from the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, or IUCN. The IUCN works to assess the status of species by looking at species populations and many threats that they face. So the IUCN has assessed more than 130,000 species, which is a huge undertaking, and have found that 38,500 species are threatened with extinction. So that's 28% of species that we've actually studied, that experts have conducted an assessment on, and we know for sure that they are threatened with extinction. So what about the species that haven't been assessed? Well, scientists estimate that 1 million species are threatened with extinction. And this slide on the right side here has some information on how we've come to this conclusion, which I'd be happy to discuss further if folks have questions after. Another indicator of the biodiversity crisis is, as I mentioned, that species are declining. So these may be species that maybe haven't declined to the point where they are threatened with extinction, but regardless, they are declining, and that's something to pay attention to. The World Wildlife Fund's Living Planet Index measured trends in 4,800 vertebrate species and found an average population decline of 68% from 1970 to 2020. And for freshwater species, this trend has been even more intense, with average population declines of 84%. And it's not just scientists who are noticing these trends. If you think about it, I'm sure you've noticed too that wildlife that maybe you saw all the time as a kid are not so easy to find. I was just out camping with some friends who talked about seeing bats all the time when they camped as a kid and only seeing 1 or 2 on some recent camping trips. Okay, so we know that we are losing biodiversity, but why? What's causing the loss of species at such a rapid rate? Well, there are 6 main drivers of extinction that you can see on the screen here, and we use the acronym CHIPPO, and these include climate change, habitat loss, invasive species, pollution, human population growth, and overutilization. And when we say overutilization, we're talking about species taken out of the wild at an unsustainable rate, and that's to be used as pets or food or medicine, etc. Okay, so what are the solutions? There are so many things we can do, and I won't have time to walk through them all, but if you take nothing else away from this talk, know that we can stop the biodiversity crisis and move toward a more sustainable system. It is absolutely possible. And I love this quote that extinction is a political choice, because we know what's driving the extinction crisis, and therefore we know the solutions needed. We are going to lose species along the way for sure, such as the one pictured here. But we can and must create the political will to turn this around and stop human-caused extinctions. The other thing to keep in mind as we talk about solutions is that the drivers of and solutions to the biodiversity crisis are deeply connected to other environmental justice issues. All justice is intertwined. So our solutions need to center the voices of oppressed communities that are disproportionately impacted by environmental degradation and climate change. So I'll start on the global scale for solutions and then talk about some national, local, and personal solutions. But to clarify, all of these things are part of the solution, and there isn't one single angle that is going to stop this crisis. So on the global scale, we have several different treaties that can help us protect biodiversity. One is the Convention on Biological Diversity, the goals of which include the conservation of biological diversity, the sustainable use of its components, and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from genetic resources. Another treaty that I work on at the center is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, which is a bit of a mouthful, but it's commonly known as CITES, which works to ensure that international trade in plants and animals does not threaten their survival in the wild. So because one of the main drivers of extinction is habitat loss, some goals for stemming the extinction crisis include protecting 30% of land by 2030 and 50% by 2050. Right now, only 16% of land and inland water ecosystems are protected, and only 8% of coastal waters and oceans are protected. In the US, only 12% of land is protected. So for climate change, there are many, many ways to address it. And we know this is another main driver of species extinctions. Project Drawdown is a great resource. It lays out 100 climate solutions on their website. And you can see some examples on this slide, which include protecting grasslands using electric cars, and providing Indigenous communities with secure legal tenure rights to their traditional forest land. Another part of the solution has to be changing the way we view progress as a society. Easier said than done. Progress cannot be based solely on economic growth and consumption of more and more resources. This graphic on the slide here shows all of the issues that we face when we move out of the regenerative and distributed economy and past this ecological ceiling, which include air pollution, ocean acidification, biodiversity loss, etc. At the national level here in the US, another solution can be found in conservation policies like the Endangered Species Act. The Endangered Species Act has prevented the extinction of 99% of species that are listed, which is pretty significant. More than 50 species have been recovered, and about 60 species who were once endangered are now considered only threatened. So they've moved up a level and recovered a little bit. All right, so another part of the solution can be planting native plants that support our birds, insects, and other wildlife. This is much better than having our yards that are just a monocrop of grass. And Homegrown National Park has estimated that the US currently has 63 million acres of lawn. So just imagine how much wildlife could be supportive if some of that lawn was transformed into a more native habitat. Okay, a personal solution to the biodiversity crisis is, as we say at the center, to take extinction off your plate. Across the world, livestock production is responsible for at least 14.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. In addition to contributing to climate change, more than 2 trillion pounds of livestock manure pollute our rivers, lakes, wetlands, and groundwater in the US. Livestock production also takes up a lot of land. So if everyone switched to a plant-based diet, we would reduce our global land use for agriculture by 75%. So again, just imagine how much space that could open up for wildlife habitat. And finally, and perhaps the best way that we can each contribute to stopping the biodiversity crisis and moving toward a more sustainable world is to use our own unique skills. So whether that's singing, painting, organizing, writing, taking pictures, planting native plants, having conversations with people in your community, whatever you are called to do to help is exactly what is needed in this moment. So thank you very much for having me today. If you would like to connect with the center, we have a bunch of ways to take action on our website. If you're interested, you can always visit biologicaldiversity.org. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diane. That was a beautiful voyage into the biological world, and it activates the desire to keep it alive. Merci beaucoup, Diane. Ça, c'était un voyage merveilleux à travers le monde biologique. Et ça m'a activé en tout cas le désir de faire tout ce que je peux pour que ça reste en vie. Et donc, on aura des questions après. Si vous avez des questions, les notez. Pour à la fin de cette session, on aura donc une question-réponse. If you have questions, write them down before you forget them, so we can use them at the end of the session during the question and answer period. The next speaker that we have is Karenna Gore, talking to the importance of relationship in the recent rise of the environmental justice movement. Karenna is an American author, lawyer, climate activist, and daughter of former U.S. Vice President Al Gore. She graduated from both Harvard and Columbia universities and is the founder and executive director of the Center for Earth Ethics at Union Theological Seminary in New York. The seminary was formed in 2015 to address the moral and spiritual dimensions of the climate crisis. Her discussion today focuses on 2 fracked gas pipelines proposed to run through the southeastern states of West Virginia, Virginia, and North Carolina. And her advocacy is anchored in the moral injustice inherent in the discrepancy between who is causing climate change and who is suffering the most from its effects. She highlights the importance of relationship in the recent rise of this environmental justice movement. She will be attending via an 8-minute video segment that we will be playing in a moment. Donc, notre prochaine intervenante, c'est Karenna Gore, qui parlera de l'importance de l'interdépendance dans la montée récente du mouvement pour la justice environnementale. Karenna est auteure, avocate et activiste américaine. Elle est la fille de l'ancien vice-président Al Gore. Elle est diplômée des universités de Harvard et Columbia, et elle est aussi fondatrice du Centre pour l'éthique terrestre au séminaire théologique de New York. Ce séminaire a été fondé en 2015 pour explorer les dimensions morales et spirituelles de la crise climatique. Sa présentation aujourd'hui se focalise sur 2 pipelines proposés pour transporter le gaz de schiste à travers la Virginie occidentale, la Virginie et la Caroline du Nord. Sa présentation est aussi ancrée dans l'injustice morale qui existe entre ceux qui provoquent le changement climatique et ceux qui en souffrent le plus. Elle souligne l'importance de l'interdépendance dans la récente montée du mouvement pour la justice environnementale. Elle nous rejoint aujourd'hui via vidéo de 8 minutes sur YouTube. Bienvenue à Karenna Gore.
It's a powerful time to be connected and to come together like never before. And I really believe that this Mountain Valley Pipeline, this fight can be a major turning point in the climate movement. And I want to tell you why. When it comes to the health of our planet, we all know that something is deeply wrong and needs to change. On Monday, the scientists known as the International Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, released their Working Group 3 Mitigation of Climate Change report. And this is just focused on how to stop it from getting worse. It made clear yet again a few things. The main cause of this climate emergency is greenhouse gas emissions from burning fossil fuels. There's a lot of distraction out there from the greenwashing about what's going on with this. The main cause is the burning of fossil fuels. We're fighting a fossil fuel pipeline here. The emissions come mostly from the wealthiest people and corporations in the wealthiest countries, but those that are hurt first and worst are on the opposite end of that spectrum, those who've done the least to cause this crisis, who live in poverty or who live close to and in harmony with nature. Every faith and wisdom and humanist tradition cries out to us to act, to do everything we can to shift away from fossil fuels now. It is a moral issue. So the climate impacts around the whole world are important. We know, we hear the ice shelves are breaking off, there's record heat at the poles. We know that results in rising sea levels, in real suffering and even death for people around the world. There are those dying from heat waves and famine and flooding across the other side of the planet. But there's also climate impacts right in the southeast of the United States. I grew up mostly in Virginia, where sea level rise and extreme heat are already causing suffering and will cost lives and livelihoods. I was born and partly raised in Tennessee, where last summer a record downpour and flash flood killed 21 people just out of nowhere. Right after that happened, there was an atmospheric scientist from North Carolina State University, Gary Lackman. He was quoted saying, "This is exactly the type of event we expect to see with increasing frequency in a warming climate." That's in the Southeast. Incidentally, I was happy to just see that the most famous Tennessean, Dolly Parton, spoke up recently on the climate crisis in her way. And she said what the cause of it was mistreating Mother Nature. She said, it's, quote, like being ugly to your mama, and it's got to stop. So I just want to say, I really think common sense may be more powerful than scientific reports. And thank you, Dolly. The climate report also makes clear that we already have the technology that we need to change away from this perilous trajectory, not only energy efficiency measures, but also the clean alternative energy sources of wind and solar and the batteries for electric vehicles. And they're getting cheaper and more efficient and more available. Actually, in some cases, people are actually bearing a more expensive energy burden because of reliance on fossil fuels. The only obstacle to making this change that we have every reason to make is politics. It is the entrenched power and greed of a system that devours all of the things that do not directly turn into its own profits. And that means nature, including air, water, soil, all the other living beings that swim and fly and crawl in the interrelated web of life, and also human culture and community. This climate crisis is about more than data and science and technology. It is about values and relationships. We are not in right relationship above with the sky and the atmosphere, because we are not in right relationship below on the ground. And the pipeline fights are what bring us into relationship on the ground. One example of how this is true is that the same activity that is the primary cause of climate change, the burning of fossil fuels, also causes that local pollution that harms people's health. We are not separate from nature. And there's significant research on these toxins that leak from fracked gas operations. Fracked gas, as we know, is natural gas is no more natural than oil or coal. When it is burned, it is heat trapping, climate changing pollution. And when it leaks, that methane, it's actually a super greenhouse gas because it is over 80 times more warming over a 20-year period than carbon emissions. We don't have 20 years. They used to say when they said it was a bridge fuel, well, we could just take 20 years. We don't have 20 years. We know that. And so when we look at these toxins that leak out from this fossil fuel infrastructure, and we look at those compressor stations and where they're located, we have to also realize environmental racism is real. The #1 indicator of the location of a toxic facility like a compressor station like that is the race of those who live nearby. And that is why it is so significant that a powerful environmental justice movement has risen up to lead the way on climate, to stop this pattern. The fight against the Union Hill compressor station that was led by the historic Black community in Buckingham County defeated that compressor station and helped take down the entire Atlantic Coast pipeline. And now the fight against the Lambert compressor station on the MVP Southgate extension has won that fight too. And I know we're going to hear more from Miss Anita Royston, who will speak after me about that. People are coming together. So just to wrap up, I want to say we can all see from the war in Ukraine, the tragic war, and our hearts are with those people suffering there, that the reliance on fossil fuels are hurting people around the world in so many ways. The role of the United States in this world is important. We can't take that for granted. This time and place, this country is significant to the direction of the whole rest of the world. And this region is significant to the direction of the whole rest of this country. And so we look at that war in Ukraine, and I want to say that we have with us here one of the leaders of this movement. Russell Chisholm is an Army vet who fought in what's known as Desert Storm. And he has said, quote, "We can't keep watching as fossil fueled wars displace and kill thousands of people around the world. Not only are these wars inhumane, they threaten the possibility of a livable future for everyone on the planet." So this is a fight against this 42-inch, 303-mile pipeline, but it is about so much more. This should be the lightning rod to jumpstart the critical last phase of this climate movement. Virginia and West Virginia hold so much history in terms of both the promise of this country and all human people, and also that presence of that evil hypocrisy on the other side of that promise that's no longer welcome in this country, that we're saying no to. People are coming together across all backgrounds to say no to. So this time and place, we have a chance to help steer this country and this world in the right direction. This fight is so close to being won. We have the federal court rulings, all the things that Joshua has said. The FERC certificate expires this year. People are tired of the landscape being torn up and the waterways and the property being seized. When they say it's complete, we know that's just a tactic. They want it to seem inevitable and all powerful. It's Goliath of a project. It's like a zombie Goliath. But guess who will win? We will win. No MVP. Thank you. I'm honored to be here. Let's hear from the real pipeline fighters who are leading the way.
Thank you so much, Karenna. That was really beautiful and inspiring. Gives everyone energy to realize we can make a difference. Merci beaucoup, Karenna. Ça, c'était vraiment très inspirant. Et ça nous donne vraiment l'impression que nous pouvons, chacun de nous, s'activer pour faire une différence dans les domaines qui nous sont propres, mais qu'on a la possibilité réellement d'agir. Merci beaucoup. Notre prochain intervenant is, the next speaker is Phil Rolliston. He's speaking to the power of public banking. In us, we trust. Phil is a former, sorry, the screen is bouncing around. Phil is a former executive director of Habitat for Humanity and was a volunteer campaign coordinator for President Obama in 2008 and Bernie Sanders in 2016. He's also a folk musician and lives in the Cranberry Wilderness area of West Virginia. He's a dedicated practitioner of engaged mindfulness in his day-to-day life. Phil Rolleston, notre prochain intervenant, va parler vers un secteur bancaire public. Cultivons la confiance en nous. Phil est l'ancien directeur exécutif de l'Habitat pour l'Humanité et coordinateur bénévole de la campagne électorale du président Obama en 2008 et de Bernie Sanders en 2016. Il est aussi musicien folk et vit dans les terres sauvages des Canneberges, une région qui fait partie de la préservation nationale des écosystèmes de la Virginie occidentale. Et il pratique la pleine conscience engagée dans sa vie quotidienne. Voilà un accueil chaleureux pour Phil Rolleston.
Hello, thank you for having me, and this is a wonderful experience listening to the other speakers today, and it's been a lot of work, everybody putting it together. I'm going to try to take a subject that's very in-depth and do it in 15 minutes. So I'm going to be pretty quick. I'm not going to try to use a PowerPoint or anything like that. But I'm going to start with 3 words. The first being ecology, the second being equity, and the third being economy. And I think these things lead in a progression to a consciousness that we have to have in order for something like public banking or any solutions we want to take on about our sustainable world. We have to have some groundwork. We have to have actually an evolution of consciousness. So let's talk about ecology. Ecology I would like to envision the whole planet as a living entity. People use the word Gaia for this, but we have this idea that we are, humans have this idea, at least, that we are separate entities and that we are separate from nature. And this is just not true. Just as our cells and the microbacteria and atoms and everything that make us up, what we think of as ourselves being human, we are part of the whole planetary life form that is, Thich Nhat Hanh calls interbeing. And we need to evolve our consciousness into not thinking that we are separate entities, that we're tied closely to everything. I have a friend of mine who has a favorite term called "there is only one of us." Okay, so with this in mind, I had one of my favorite quotes from Buckminster Fuller is that the great lie, I mean, not a quote, but a paraphrase, the great lie is that there isn't enough to go around for everyone. And this is a lie. And on this lie is predicated greed and separateness and competition and the things that keep us from building a sustainable world. So let's go on to the word equity. Equity is usually used in terms of fairness and equal opportunity and whatever, but it's usually in terms of just people. But this also relates to the other living creatures and beings that we are participating in this interbeing with. And there are several places where they're actually encoding laws to say that you know, species, flora and fauna of a place have rights, civil rights. So, but equity comes out of our understanding of this whole interbeing, interrelatedness that we have, this whole family, if you will, that is this planet and this biosphere that we're on. So, out of the ecology and the understanding of this living being, we can come to understand that all of our human brothers and sisters, as well as like the Native Americans called the dog people and the deer people and the horse people, all of these entities, all of us have a place in a niche, and that we're all connected. There's truly only one of us. Okay, so now we move to economy, and how does this relate to public banking? The idea of this talk is to talk about how we can use tools within the legal structure that exists now to fund the kind of things that we want to have happen. But a public bank will only work if we have this consciousness. Otherwise, a public bank can be used to do things that we don't like, that a lot of people are talking about right now, whether it be funding wars or fracking and fossil fuel development or whatever. And I would say that these three terms, ecology and equity and economy, are all related to really being this one system. It's all one economy, it's all equitable, and it's all one living, interbeing thing. So now public banking. Most people don't really know, and excuse me if I tell you stuff that you already know about how banking works. In the United States, the law is currently that any bank well, banks first are established by the state governments. They're not established by federal governments. They're established by state governments. They're given their charters. And the rule is you pass certain criteria and you have the proper amount of assets and capitalization. The rule is that you have to keep 10% of the money you have out in loans. You have to have that available in your bank's assets, not in the money deposited in the bank or anything like that, but the money that the bank actually has as profit and assets has to be in that bank. And then you can leverage that. 10% has to be in the bank, and you can leverage that money 10 times. So if the value of the bank is if they have $1 million in assets, or $100 million, let's say, in assets, they can have loans out to $1 billion. Okay. Now, what does this mean? What it means is the banks create money. That's what this is. You make a loan, and it's not like you just give dollars or francs or whatever to the people. Generally, it's just on ledger books and computers, a debt and a credit. So, the way private banks work is that their mission statement, their job is to maximize profit for their shareholders who own the bank within the legal limits of the law. So they're going to want to get as much interest as they can get away with. They're going to want to do, you know, whatever they can to make money for their shareholders. Okay. Now, a public bank is a separate thing. A public bank is owned by a public entity instead of let's take the example of a state bank in the United States, because there is one state bank that's a public bank that actually exists. So the state, let's say West Virginia, the state of West Virginia could right now, as a state, apply for and use the state assets for having a state public bank of West Virginia. Now, they wouldn't operate the bank, they would own the bank. They would take the place of the shareholders. The public banks are operated by professional bankers, but they are tied to a mission statement. And they're tied to rules and bylaws of their incorporation and to their board of directors. Generally, public banks have community input and councils or advisory boards. So why have a public bank? Well, the first thing is that with a public bank, instead of trying to increase the shareholder value, the object is to leverage as much money in low-cost, affordable loans for the kind of things that you have in your mission statement that you want to do, i.e. for sustainable development, for sustainable economic development, for good energy sources, whatever is in the interest of the public of that, the citizens of that state, or it could be a city or a community. It could also be a nation. So what happens essentially is that there's a bank in North Dakota. The Bank of North Dakota is a public bank. It's the only operating public bank in the country right now. In Germany, I know that about 40% of the banks in Germany are public banks. I don't know about France. I don't know, and there's some other countries, but I'm just going to talk about West Virginia and the United States itself. So the Bank of North Dakota is owned and has community input, and they have their mission statement, and they have been operating since the turn of the century, of the 20th century. So they were established right around 1908 or something like that. They have survived the Depression. They have survived the Great Recession of 2008. They have survived the pandemic, and none of the banks, of the small banks that were in North Dakota had to fold, had to go bankrupt. The reason is the Bank of North Dakota, their model is they have this one central bank, and they work through community banks, small independent banks, not big corporate banks that are multi-state, but community banks, so that they are like their branch offices. So they have, say that you've got a allocation for, you've got a part of your mission statement to provide loans for solar power on people's homes or businesses. So you wouldn't go to the Bank of North Dakota straight. You would go to your local community bank and say, I understand that there's a loan program for doing this solar power on my house. And they would say, yes, and that bank works in cooperation with the Bank of North Dakota. The Bank of North Dakota provides about 90% of the capital required for that local bank to fund and to leverage into the loan that you want. So the local bank's taking 10% of the risk, the state public bank is taking 90% of the risk. You still have to qualify for these loans. It's not a giveaway, it's not free money, but it's very low interest money. Everybody wins. Community banks are local people. They know the people in their area. And so that's why this model seems to work really well. But here again, go back to the beginning of this conversation. The important thing is to have this consciousness and this awareness of what you really want. Because if you don't do that, no matter how well an intellectual scheme is, the intellect divides things. It's a divisive instrument. It's useful, but it divides a table from the chair to this and that. No purely intellectual scheme is going to make the sustainable world happen that we need to make happen. That requires spirit, that requires heart, that requires that which unifies things, which pulls things together. So if you have the proper attitude and awareness and consciousness, and and this has got to be a big thing, and it does happen politically, but this is something that we all have to do. You have that awareness, then you can establish, West Virginia, as an example, could establish a public bank, and then there are two essential things in that establishment, in that charter, that will determine how it stays in line with the values we're talking about that we want to see. Instead of funding pipelines, we want to fund solar panels and community water projects and stuff like that. So the first thing is you have to have a really good mission statement that clearly defines what your values are and what the money you're going to leverage is going to be. And then the second thing is that you have to have a great codified community input, democratic input, so that the people can say, this is what we need. And they elect the advisory council. The advisory council advises the board of directors, and the board of directors and the executives department of the bank enable the vision. So that's how it can work. It could work tomorrow in West Virginia. North Dakota has been doing it now for over 100 years. The only problem with some of their stuff is their consciousness is not where I'm talking about. And consequently, they had a big oil fracking boom in North Dakota, and the Bank of North Dakota helped fund some of that. So public banks aren't just necessarily, just because they're a public bank doesn't mean you're going to make the right decisions. And that's why you've got to have this consciousness and an awareness, and then codify that as best as you can. Hopefully I haven't gone over too long. It's a very short and brief thing. The discussion could go on for a long time, but this is a very doable way of doing things. And more we're going to see that happen in the world. And it's the only way that we can materially fund the kind of things that we really need to see happen for our sustainable future. So there's that. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Phil. That was fantastic. I understood quite a bit more than usual, more than I had in previous discussions. It probably takes a while for things to sink in, about the possibility of public banking and the use of it and how it can operate. Really, that was quite enlightening. Et merci beaucoup, Phil Rolliston. Ça, c'était très facile à comprendre quels sont les ingrédients qui nous permettraient de bénéficier d'un système bancaire public. Donc, là, nous arrivons à la fin de la liste des intervenants d'aujourd'hui et nous pouvons ouvrir une petite séance de questions et réponses. Alors, nous avons donc plusieurs intervenants auxquels on peut poser des questions, que ce soit des gens évidemment qui peuvent répondre, donc David Roper qui est toujours avec nous, Dianne Dubois qui est, je pense, toujours sur Zoom, Karenna Gore, non, c'est pas possible, et Phil. Donc on a 3 personnes à qui on peut poser des questions. David Roper, le physiciste.
Il y a déjà, Rosanna, il y a déjà une question qui a été posée pour David Roper. C'est Dominica qui va la poser.
So here's the question. Hello. There's a question that was written by Mr. Chad Ober. The question is for David Roper. If you could say something about the sustainability of earth materials, gold, copper, uranium, etc., those that we need for such industries as solar panels, how can they be recycled?
So a question involving the solar panels, the materials that are being used for solar panels, how can they be recycled? From Chad Oba, who is at the Buckingham, Friends of Buckingham.
Well, I'm not very knowledgeable about that. I have been reading some things recently about that, that there are companies that do that now, here in the United States at least. I know more about recycling batteries than I do about recycling solar panels. You've inspired me to learn more about that.
Okay, great. Okay, I have a question for you also while you're here, which is that I've been thinking for a long time about, ever since I got a digging fork, to dig the earth, and somebody went into Walmart and got it, and plastic handle, and they just gave, okay, so I'm using that thing, not really thinking very much about it, but it broke down after about 2 years of, you got to get in there and move the earth with this fork. So the plastic that was around the whole thing falls apart. The piece of metal that goes into the tube like this was only that short. I mean, it was this short, and therefore it wasn't even holding. So in terms of when you were talking about us working together as a global community to make sure we have what it takes for future generations to survive, in terms of being able to provide one's own food, one needs a digging fork that works. And of course, I connected with some people here that collect old tools. So they came to one of our previous forums, and they brought these incredibly metal, the entire thing is metal. It's one piece. It's not some tiny little thing sticking in a piece of plastic. I'm thinking about rebirthing the ability to remake these old tools or find these old tools, have them be useful in a community. We might not have enough for everyone to have one tool themselves, but we need to know where they are because they work, and all this other stuff does not work. It's totally not sustainable, and we're just using resources.
Is a question.
What do you think about it?
You probably bought that because it's less expensive than the metal one, right?
Sure, it was most likely a cheap thing,
Well, the trouble with a plastic device like that is that kind of plastic is not recyclable.
On top of
it. Even plastic containers you get, not all of them are recyclable. We used to, in Blacksburg, recycled only 1 and 2 plastic containers. Then we started recycling all of them. Then they found out that there was no market 5 and 6 and 7.
Oh,
So they quit.
so went to the
So
landfill.
now we just throw away 5 and 6 and 7.
Right.
Which hurts me a lot. And I'm trying to teach myself before I buy something that I look at the bottom of it and see what the plastic number is. And trying to buy only things that are due 1 and 2 so that I know I can recycle them. Otherwise, it just go into the garbage.
Right, directly into
and that's what happens with your tool.
Right.
And that kind of plastic is not recyclable. Whereas if it were metal and the metal broke, that's recyclable.
Yeah. Can be remelted.
And so it pays in the long run to buy the better tool.
That's what my father always said. He was from Italy, and he just said, Rosanna, buy the best. Don't buy the cheapest.
Yeah. That's about all I can tell you about that.
Okay, well, that's good. Do we have some other questions? Like maybe Diane has a question to ask Dave while he's here?
Yeah, I was actually just going to add to that conversation about the tool. You know, I think one of the issues is that folks don't have the money to invest in the products that are going to last a long time. And one model that I've seen here where I live in Asheville, we actually have a tool library. So works similar to a library with books where people can go and check out different tools that they want to use. So I think that community-based model can be a really good solution, and just having this, you know, few sets of really good tools that everyone has access to.
Yeah, that seems like a solution because everyone having one in their garage, that's already overproduction. If we work together as a community, we can reduce the amount of entropy we're creating simply by moving earth around and pulling out metals.
The Habitat Restore in Blacksburg has a tool library.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, I helped set up that restore back in 2007. And now it's a big money maker for building houses by Habitat. But and I've donated a lot. I mean, I'm 86 years old and I figure I don't have much longer on this earth. So I'm gradually donating my tools to that. And I've indicated that when I'm gone that all my tools go to that tool library.
Wow, I can't believe it. I asked a simple question.
It's a good idea, and more communities should do that. Well,
yeah.
And I don't know exactly how it works, but I assume that you can check it out like you would in a library, and you are expected to bring it back.
Right.
I don't know how they make sure you do bring it back, but
well, they probably take a little.
But I think most people would.
Rosanna, sorry, Rosanna, tu veux bien apparaître à l'écran parce qu'on voit un bout de tes cheveux juste.
Ah ben.
Voilà, resserrez-vous un petit peu. Voilà. Okay. Voilà, c'est mieux. Merci. Merci.
Ok, ben ça c'était super ça. Ok, donc.
I'd like to ask Phil.
Je vais.
Across the United States, you mentioned North Dakota. Are there any other places besides North Dakota where these public banks are?
You want to sit there?
Yeah, I can. Yes. California, the question is are there any other public banks in the United States right now? California has enabled a law and passed a law that allows communities in California to establish public banks. So right now, Los Angeles and Oakland, California are in the process of codifying and establishing municipal public banks. There are something like 12 different states throughout the country right now that are trying to start public banks, and that are in different processes, different levels of the process. Some have gotten the governments to explore the possibilities. public banks saved a lot of money for the communities. We didn't even talk about bonds that people get for like road bonds and stuff. The bond market's awful. If you leverage and get a loan from the bond market to upgrade your city water system, for example, you're going to pay almost as much money as you're borrowing in interest to get that happening, and they just stretch it out. Plus, that money is going to these big investment banks, and what are they doing? They're making wars with them. They're supporting fossil fuels with them. They're doing a whole lot of things that you don't really want to have, that are unsustainable and you don't want to have. West Virginia and its road projects could save millions and millions of dollars by not having the high interest and having a public bank that could leverage that money. And here again, the state only owns the bank, so the bank can make a loan to the state to do the things that they want, or to communities. So yes, there are a lot of communities that are looking into it, state level and city level, but California is the only place that's made it legal right now for municipalities to do that.
So in California, are there any restrictions on those public banks as to what they can use their money for?
Well, they're just trying to codify that right now. You mean by the state government, or by the public
by
bank
the rules
charter?
that set up these banks? I mean, you were saying that the banks should be used for sustainability,
right,
rather than for terrible things.
Right. Well, this is most of the people who are doing this banking movement, public banking movement in California, are very environmentally conscious. And they're also reacting to the way the state was ripped off by Wells Fargo Bank, which was holding the state money. And here again, states or municipalities hold money. They don't just keep all their money in the Capitol building in the basement somewhere. They put it in a bank and they try to make money on it. With a public bank, like a public state bank, the state of West Virginia, for example, all its money and cash assets and stuff would be sitting in the Bank of West Virginia, the public bank of West Virginia, and that way, when they sit it in an investment bank, they're doing the same thing. They're doing fracking and they're doing fossil fuels. They're doing making the war machine. They're doing that stuff. So. I think that's a long answer, and I can't give you definitively what their particular mission statements are and how their structure is. But there's a great organization in the United States called the Public Bank Foundation. And Ellen Brown is a great name to Google or search for, and she has some great information about public banking. She's maybe one of the best experts out there. But I know that the Public Banking Institute, advises almost all the movement happening within the states and also in other countries about creating public banks. And so they're very aware of this. So I think that yes, they're trying to make it where the money's going to do the kind of things that we're trying to go for.
Well, there must be a lot of resistance from the current banks against public.
Well, there is, and there's a resistance from the Fed. They don't like it. I'm not trying to dominate the conversation, and interrupt me if you want. But the United States has the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States is just a cartel of bankers. Private bankers, and the U.S. has ceded the right to print money to the Federal Reserve Bank. Every time the United States wants to quote print money, they have to pay interest on that money to the Federal Reserve. There should be a public bank for the nation itself. Okay, I'm going to get out of here. That's question.
Let's see. I had a question for Diane.
J'ai une question, Rosanna.
Oui, moi, je mean, I had a question for Diane. I'm just trying to pull it back up here. I have to wait until it comes back to me, Diane.
I had a question for David, if you prefer, I go ahead with that first. David, you mentioned the issue with single-use plastics, and I was curious, I've been interested to learn more about the work in the U.S. to try to ban single-use plastics. I know we have a couple of cities that have bans on them, but I'm curious if you're familiar with that at all, if you have any more information on where we are in that effort.
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing.
Oh, okay. She wanted to know if you have any information on the general, let's say, U.S. policy regarding single-use plastics. Are they moving towards banning them, or do we know anything about the political?
I don't know of any effort going on at the federal level.
No. Okay. Yeah, which is really the level that we would need something to occur.
I mean, it's happening locally. Roanoke, Virginia just outlawed plastic bags. In California, particularly, I think there's been a lot of local. I'm not sure it's the whole state there. Might be, I'm not sure, but at certain places in California, they ban a lot of things. I'd like to see them ban any plastics you can't recycle. You know, most of those plastics are made from oil and natural gas, mainly natural gas, I think.
I know, yeah.
And so you could say that natural gas has its good uses, but only if it makes plastics that you recycle and that you don't dump in the ocean.
Right.
Because we know what's happening in the ocean with regard to plastics right now.
Oh yeah, that brings me to the question I was going to ask you, Diane. Is I'd heard quite a while ago doing research regarding this fracking was one of the things that motivated a lot of research. And I wound up finding out that there were all these gyres, they're calling them,
yeah.
These things in the oceans where you've got these giant miles and miles and miles.
The size of Texas.
The size of Texas of plastic that's just circulating around because of the currents. And you are involved in, what's it called, sustainable ways of trade. You were talking about sustainable trade. And I was wondering what's happening on that level, because that is stifling out all the life in the ocean, even from allowing the sun to get in, because these plastics are probably reflecting the sun so that the light can't get down further into these species. And I think that was one of your areas of expertise, the reptiles and the other marine species. So do you have anything to tell us about what's happening with that?
Yeah, you know, I don't work on the oceans and plastic in particular. We do have a program at the center of folks who are working on that directly, but absolutely, the pollution in our oceans, the amount of plastic in our oceans is incredibly alarming. And it is having an impact on, you know, every level of wildlife and ecosystems in our ocean. I work primarily on marine aquarium fish. And so I do assessments of threats that these fish are facing. And primarily my work is on the trade, as you mentioned, of fish being taken out of the ocean for the aquarium trade. And the impacts of that on their ecosystem. So I work less on the plastic, but absolutely that is a major concern for these species as well.
And when you say aquarium, because I wasn't even quite sure what you mean by that, they're taking fish out of the sea to put them in aquariums?
Yeah, so it's to supply the aquarium trade. There is some captive breeding of aquarium species that you may see in the pet store and things like that. But a lot of those fish are actually coming out of the wild, so being scooped out of coral reefs and things like that. And in some cases, it's at an unsustainable rate. The Banggai cardinal fish is one that I've worked on. It's a species that exists in Indonesia. It has a relatively small range, and so it's very susceptible to something like this, where it may be poached throughout its entire range just because it is so small. They're relatively slow to reproduce, and they're pretty easy to catch. They kind of just freeze when they're posed with a threat. So they're unfortunately not helping themselves out very much by doing that. And a lot of them end up dying in transit to their destinations. And so then more are taken out of the wild. So it can be very unsustainable. And those are definitely areas where we want to be paying attention to and doing population surveys and, stopping the trade when it's necessary.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Well, speaking of plastics pollution, a lot of studies have been done recently that almost every human has these microplastics throughout their body.
Yeah, I've heard. That's right.
Yeah.
We've got them in the blood or in the cells.
Yeah.
Now, I had another question for you, actually. How are we doing for time? We're okay.
J'avais une question. J'avais une question pour ramener les choses sur un peu le terrain de la sagesse. Et ça s'adresse à David Roper et Diane Dubois.
He has a question that is going to be addressed simultaneously to Dave Roper and Diane.
Karenna Gore a dit qu'il y avait une urgence, que le temps était court devant les problèmes qui sont posés. Et Diana,
there's an urgency regarding time to resolve these problems that we're dealing with.
Et Diane et David Roper dans leur schéma, ont montré aussi une urgence de la situation par rapport aux espèces, par rapport au pétrole et au gaz. Ils ont montré une urgence aussi.
And both of you, Diane and Dave, you have, in your presentations, you have talked about the fact that there is an urgency to take action.
Face à ce constat, est-ce que les solutions ne sont que des solutions matérielles ou est-ce que nous devons changer notre façon de voir le monde? Et si c'est le cas, est-ce que la sagesse n'a pas un rôle à jouer pour nous aider à changer notre façon de voir le monde?
Yeah, so he's asking, the changes that we can make, are they only material changes, or is there a consciousness change, as he was talking about regarding the banking system, a consciousness change that is required to actually have more effective action being?
Well, yeah, people have to, in order for something to happen, people have to decide it needs to happen, right? Yeah, so, yeah.
Donc, il a dit, I'm going to tell him in French, pour que quelque chose se passe, il faut que les gens décident qu'il y ait quelque chose qui doit se passer. Donc, première chose est une prise de conscience.
Yeah.
You're right.
But how to get that people to do that is, I don't know the answer.
Right. Alors, comment faire pour que les gens puissent justement se poser une question ou prendre conscience qu'il y a quelque chose qui ne va pas? Il ne sait pas exactement comment on peut faire pour donner l'étincelle à cet état d'être qui pose la question.
All I know to do is keep writing letters to the editor of the newspaper, which I do regularly, and they publish most of them. And I get a lot of response from them, but most response I get from people who are already convinced that something needs to be done.
Right. Lui, il dit que sa méthode, c'est d'écrire des lettres au journal local, donc dans cette ville de Blacksburg, universitaire, et il reçoit beaucoup de feedback sur ce qu'il publie dans le journal. Mais il dit que pour la plupart, c'est des gens qui font partie du chœur, enfin du choir. C'est-à-dire, it comes mostly from people that are part of the choir. They already know about this, but they are interacting based on what he's saying. But do you not think that it could stimulate, because you get information coming in from different people asking things in different ways, and some of the people, it might expand their consciousness, even though they're already on board, they might be able to get to a higher level.
Well, and hopefully it incrementally expands the number of people.
Right.
That's the hope.
Right. Et donc l'espoir, c'est que de manière pas par pas, incrément, donc des incréments, on élargit sa conscience et le nombre de personnes qui peuvent avoir cette conscience va aussi augmenter.
In one of my slides, I expressed some optimism, but I'm pretty not optimistic on occasion.
Donc, dans un de ces trucs-là, il a exprimé un côté optimiste, mais en gros, il est souvent pas optimiste. Mais cet optimisme a quand même est entré dans le...
But he was asking Diane also, what do you think, Diane?
Yeah, I think that's a great response. And, you know, in some ways, I think people with this consciousness are already the majority. I think, you know, there's research that shows that, for example, with seafood and with marine mammals being caught in nets, there's research that shows that people want to buy their seafood from fisheries that are not harming marine mammals. The majority of people want that. And so, you know, my first job out of college was talking to kids about endangered species and doing environmental education. And they were constantly asking, well, what can I do to save the species? What can I do today? And so the next generation can be really inspiring for that too. So in some ways, I think we are the majority. And as David mentioned, we need to be really vocal about what we want and you know, protecting our planet. And Letters to the Editor is a great one. I know that's often the most read section of the newspaper. And for me, I do a lot of calling my senators and representatives. They are actually like saved as favorites in my iPhone so that I can call them and be vocal. And as I mentioned in my presentation, there are so many ways to do that. Maybe you are more of an artist and you can do it through your work and things like that. But I think we do need that shift of consciousness, and I do think it's happening, and we really need to be louder to show that we are the majority.
Elle, en fait, une des premières missions qu'elle a eues quand elle est sortie de son système d'éducation, c'était de travailler avec des enfants. Et donc, exposer bien sûr aux enfants quels sont des dangers pour certaines espèces. Et les enfants posaient la question à elle sans arrêt. Mais alors, qu'est-ce que je peux faire? Qu'est-ce que je peux faire aujourd'hui? Alors, elle leur donnait des choses à faire. Et ensuite, ils voulaient savoir plus. Alors, qu'est-ce que je peux faire de plus pour sauver des espèces? Et que, donc, elle a beaucoup d'espoir au niveau pour les générations futures. Et c'est sûr que quelqu'un qui travaille avec les enfants, c'est comme une table rase, les enfants. On interagit avec eux, la conscience se fait au fur et à mesure qu'on parle avec eux. So consciousness can expand while you're talking to a child. In other words, it's a constant expansion. That's what they're in. They don't have fixed ideas like we do.
Yeah. Go ahead, Phil.
Somebody else is going to speak to that.
I'll try to do this very quick. Consciousness, we can do a lot in ourselves. A lot of the work is within ourselves. We have the intellectual ideas and everything, but the real trick, I think, and this is what I think the Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh really communicated well in his latest book, which is about Zen and the art of saving the world or saving the planet. We have to learn to talk to each other again. And it's not just talking to the guys that already believe what we think, you know, and we're not preaching to the choir. We have to reach out to other folks. And the trick of doing that is the opposite of what you think. You're never going to argue somebody into anything. You're never going to just intellectually convince somebody for the most of the part in anything. What you can do, and what is so dearly important now, is to listen. Engage people one-on-one in every opportunity you have, and listen to why they feel the different ways they do. Not so that you can just say, okay, here's my end and I'm going to counteract that, but to really, truly understand where somebody's coming from. And when you do that, people, if you do it, he calls it deep listening. If you do that, people, it loosens up. People feel like they're being heard, and everybody wants to be heard. And if you really do it, you gain understanding of where that person is and the feeling of where it is. And when people feel that they're really truly understood, it loosens up, and everybody can have compassion. And compassion is what we have to have. This idea of separateness, and this camp is the bad guys and this camp is the good guys, that's a consciousness we have to change, because we're all one big thing. And if we don't do that, you know, it's probably what's going to change consciousness is being forced to by cataclysmic events.
Yeah, which is how it always changed, you know, through our evolutionary history.
So,
yeah. Donc, en fait, oui, il a parlé de une des bases, c'est de pouvoir écouter les autres, et à partir du moment où on peut écouter, au lieu d'avoir une envie de fournir une réponse, ça nous ramène dans le champ de la compassion, où on peut comprendre pourquoi quelqu'un pense de cette manière-là, pourquoi il agit de cette manière-là. Et voilà. Donc, on reprend sur cette idée de...
Si on veut revenir sur la discussion hier, parce que ça peut pas être un point de vue individuel, ce que disait Diane de l'éducation des enfants, c'est bien l'enjeu, c'est-à-dire éduquer. Comment, pour éduquer, il faut avoir un système. C'est pas simplement dire aux enfants juste ça c'est bien ou c'est pas bien, ça c'est une base, mais il faut avoir un système. Ce qu'on a vu dans la première session avec Ubuntu et avec le témoignage de Cristal, c'est que la sagesse nous propose non pas un point de vue de quelqu'un quel qu'il soit, mais une structure de réflexion, une façon d'entrer en relation avec le monde. Parce que les enfants qui sont éduqués par Diane, qui vont vouloir faire de leur mieux parce qu'ils ont ce cœur d'enfant, ce cœur pur, ils vont ensuite rentrer dans un système qui va changer les choses. Donc la question, elle se pose peut-être au niveau du système, et que là, la sagesse a quelque chose à nous proposer. On l'a vu avec Cristal et on l'a vu avec Ubuntu. C'est ça que je veux dire.
He was saying that wisdom has something to propose in terms of the way that we are educating, let's say, children, and it can be brought to light in the way that we are talking with, whether it be children or other people, that we can use wisdom. The wisdom has been around on the planet for eons. As soon as we started observing and remembering what we observed from one situation to the next. So, yeah, definitely. Also, I'm thinking I never was an educator of children, but I interact with them quite a lot because I love their spontaneity. And I think that I'm not thinking about educating them because that's not the avenue that I'm in. but it's simply interacting with them. And in that interaction, they're in the moment. They're not thinking that they're in an educational system. They're just there with you, and they're interacting with you, and they're looking up to you because you're an adult, and and when they see that you're paying attention to them, and you're listening to their ideas also, it just kind of goes by itself. Yeah. It's wonderful. Okay. Do we have any other questions that came in on the chat? I see 27 people have put things on the chat. But we are getting down to the wire in terms of time.
Could we just read the chats after we quit?
Yeah. Est-ce que c'est possible que lui, par exemple, pourrait lire ce qui est marqué sur les chats une fois qu'on termine cette session?
Je pense que oui, mais ça c'est Thibaut qui doit nous le confirmer.
Ok.
C'est pas sûr.
All panelists. He said
Non,
not
il dit
sure.
c'est pas sûr, mais il va essayer de le sauvegarder.
Okay.
Et il faut insister sur quelque chose parce que je pense que tu as pas traduit bien ce que j'ai dit. Que la sagesse ne s'oppose pas à la raison. Que la sagesse ne s'oppose pas à la raison et que la sagesse ne s'oppose pas à la science. Ça, c'est très important à dire aujourd'hui. Que la sagesse a une grande considération pour la raison, pour l'intelligence humaine. La question, c'est quand on regarde les civilisations anciennes, les modes de vie de la sagesse. C'est pour ça qu'elle a quelque chose à nous apprendre. Il faut parler de Ubuntu, parler de cristal, c'est-à-dire c'est des exemples de cette sagesse ancienne, qui a un système de référence. Si nous voulons changer le monde, nous avons besoin d'un système différent de pensée, pas simplement basé sur la raison, même si c'est une grande lumière pour l'humanité.
Ok. Beaucoup de phrases ensemble.
Si
normalement, on devrait avoir un truc qui envoie un pile électrique pour arrêter le début. Yes, anyway, the idea being, I don't think anyone here got the idea that science, wisdom is opposed to science or to practical thinking or logic. Did anyone have that idea?
No, I'm saying that science without wisdom is incomplete.
Right. Yes. Lui, il dit ça d'une autre manière, c'est que la science sans la sagesse et la sagesse sans la science, on peut dire, parce que les deux se travaillent ensemble, ou l'un ou l'autre serait incomplet si on n'était pas en train de ramener les deux ensemble, right? I'm sorry, I'm speaking in French. So yeah, right. Hey, toi, and you as a physicist, you are not thinking that there's. How do you feel? Because you being a physicist of nature, but I know you were involved in religion back at some point. I found on the internet. But anyway, how do you feel about the bringing together of this wisdom that isn't necessarily born out of the scientific method, but it is nevertheless born out of a method that is scientific, which is observation, even though we don't think of it that way.
I think there's more to life than science, but I regard myself as a secular humanist.
Right, c'est lui qui est un humaniste séculaire. He's a secular humanist.
I think we have to be very clear that we're not talking about religion, we are talking about ancient wisdom that is represented by, for example, by the Indians. And it's a change of system we are talking about. A system that is based on ancient wisdom. And today's system is only based on reason and not on what we have. It's not global. It doesn't take into consideration everything that has happened in the past. That's why we're talking about an ancient wisdom. And reason has led us to this point where we are today.
Oui, that's right.
Yes.
Yes, it's the over emphasis on reason that has led us to, but of course, then what really has done it, it's basically greed. It's not so much overemphasis on science. It's self-service is really the problem. Serving the self, on sert soi-même. C'est ça le problème.
Oui, mais que l'avidité s'est servie de la raison de la science.
It has used this the science and this knowledge.
Et la science n'a pas été assez forte pour les arrêter.
And science was not strong enough to stop them, to stop the greed.
Oh, yeah, sure. That's right. Yeah.
Alors, où est la
and
force?
wisdom wasn't strong enough either at the time. I mean, maybe we have forgotten the ancient wisdom, and if we had constantly been reminded of it from one generation to the next, we would have stayed on track. But who knows?
Wisdom is an evolving thing, just as science is. Science is really different than it was a long time ago. And this is an evolutionary thing. It's a changing, growing thing, as we become more aware. This is a consciousness of evolution.
And somebody said something recently, which is the opportunity we have right now. We're being given a huge opportunity. It's almost like a gift. With all this horrible mess going on, fish being strangled by plastic string and I don't know what. But now is our time to stand up here, given all this, using the information we have, whether it be ancient wisdom, scientific method, logic, simple techniques of observation that people here in West Virginia had, and we have somebody this afternoon that will be talking about that, Paula Mann. Now is our chance to gather all that and bring it out, which is the purpose of the Seats of Wisdom, bring it out so that it can be made, we can just remember it as part of the mix. It's like on the radio, you're constantly playing the same old tube, the numéro un, the number one song, and in comes some new music, and we're putting new music into the mix right now.
I'm reading a book about the mind, and he says, it's along the line of what you were saying, I think, that logic will not convince people. You have to deal with their emotions. And then once you get their emotions, that they understand that you understand their emotions, then logic can come in.
That's the compassion.
It loosens the whole conversation. Yeah. And when and that's because you're respecting each other. Mm-hmm. Right now, we're in this divisive camp. They're environmentalists are as nasty as any fascists out there, and they're judgmental about people and everything else. And we have to stop that. If we really want the whole thing to change and be able to reach out, we have to do that work. And it's individual. It's us changing ourselves in order to do that in our everyday interaction.
Yeah. And we have an incredible political situation here in the United States, giving us the most polarized version of political parties that we've ever had in possibly history, I don't know. But nevertheless, it's super polarized. And the ability to be able to look at somebody from whatever other side that anybody might be on. I'm not on any sides anymore. I think that there's one thing behind both sides. And that thing is just simply wanting to run the world and be the players and self-serving and things of that sort. But the ability to be able to jump over from one side to the other side and look at a person and say, and understand why what so-and-so says, whoever it may be, one of these people on TV, why do they listen to that? Why are they interested in that? What is that person saying that's talking to them in a way that animates them? Because they're getting animated. People who were asleep are waking up, but they're waking up to a piece of the picture that isn't really, one that guns could resolve, for example. Of course, they're waking up to something, but the idea is that they're going to buy guns to resolve it. But that needs to be discussed because that's what they feel. They feel they need to defend themselves from an onslaught of something. It's a world out there. So it is 12:14, and we are starting again at 2 p.m. Donc, on va reprendre à quelle heure en France? 20h? 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, oui, 20h, on reprend. N'est-ce pas?
I've enjoyed being here and I need to hit the road.
Yes.
Go on.
Okay, well, thank you so much for this.
Merci
Diane,
beaucoup.
I was going to ask you something. Diane, is the PowerPoint, could it be made available to somebody who might want to share it with other people?
That's a good question. I'm happy to make it available to folks. I would need to check with the organization to make sure it's okay to share beyond that without one of us presenting it. But I'm happy to share with the folks that were here today for sure, and I can circle back with you.
Please don't talk this. I won't be able to hear it. Okay, sorry, I don't think I got all that because there were other people talking here.
Oh, no worries. Yeah, so I'm happy to share with the folks that are here today. I would just need to check with the organization and make sure it's okay for folks to share it beyond that without one of us presenting it. But I'm happy to share with everyone here, and I'll circle back with you about sharing beyond that.
Okay, great. Yeah, it's just an idea because all these things between Dave has his PowerPoint would be open to anybody. So we could send it to you if you're interested. And because the two are working together in synergy, I thought it could be an interesting package, for example, for people to see both sides of that coin, the biological side, the physical side. But I understand how things can be, so if it's possible, that'll be great. If not, yeah. Okay. Thank you very much,
Thank you.
everybody.